Two terms when describing the cardiac cycle, or the beating of the heart, that we should know are systole and diastole. Before we get into the various types of systole and diastole, what we should note is that systole refers to contraction, and diastole refers to relaxation. So we've been talking about this already in terms of contraction and relaxation of the atria and the ventricles. But now we want to take a closer look and use the correct terminology of systole and diastole. As I mentioned earlier, when the atria contract, they both contract at the same time. But what we should refer to this as is atrial systole. The atrial systole occurs in such a way that both the right and the left atrium contract at the same time, forcing blood down into the right and left ventricles. A heart then undergoes ventricular systole, contraction of the ventricles. While ventricular systole is occurring, the atria are relaxing or undergoing atrial diastole. Because the atria are relaxing and the ventricles are contracting, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are closing to prevent the backflow mentioned earlier in the unit. The blood instead goes up into the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. Then we have diastole. The atria are fully relaxed and the ventricles relax themselves as well. If we were to move this out of the way, just for a better visual of a heart, if we were to actually look at a heart beating, it would look like this, where it's fairly quick, but you'll note that the atria contract first, and then the ventricles contract just after that, and for a moment after that, the heart is fully relaxed in diastole. So how does the heart actually know when to beat? And how does that signal pass through the heart? We want to move on to describe the conduction system of the heart. The conduction system is made up of various components here, and we want to take a look at how the signal passes from one portion to another. So we'll start with the sinoatrial node, or the pacemaker. Ultimately, we'll look later at how the nervous system actually signals the heart to change how quickly it's beating, but the sinoatrial node is called the pacemaker. It's ultimately what starts the signal for the heart to contract. Therefore, our heart kind of beats independently of our brain. I do not constantly need to send signals down from my brain to my heart to cause it to contract. That's a good thing, because if I were to ever, let's say, be sick and pass out, my brain, even though maybe I've gone unconscious, wouldn't then be in a situation where it stops sending signals to my heart. My SA node works independently. So the SA node is the first step here in the conduction of the contraction signal. Let's move this heart out of the way and start with that. So the SA node starts the contraction, and it sends that contraction signal throughout the atrial conducting fibers seen here. Those atrial conducting fibers more or less function like neurons, as we saw in the nervous system. The signal moves from the SA node out through the atrial conducting fibers because those atrial conducting fibers undergo depolarization. That depolarization or conduction signal moves down the atrial conducting fibers, and some of them then connect to the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node gets its name because it is a node between the atrium and the ventricles. When it receives the signal from the atrial conducting fibers, it pauses that signal for a fraction of a second and then sends that signal along to the ventricles. It pauses so that we don't have the atria contracting at exactly the same time as the ventricles, because if they did, where would all the blood go? The heart would be contracting as one giant muscle all at the same time and potentially burst because the blood would have nowhere to travel to. Instead, as we've already looked at, the atria contract, and then while they relax, the ventricles contract. The ventricles contract because after the pause of the atrioventricular node, they send the depolarization signal along the bundle of His. The bundle of His run to the interventricular septum, the portion shown here that divides the right and left sides of the heart. And then the bundle actually branches into the right and left bundles. The right and left bundles run down to the Purkinje fibers, which wrap around and then up the side of the heart. As you can see, there's lots of branching off the Purkinje fibers, so the depolarization signal can get to all the regions of the heart. As that depolarization occurs, because of the movement of sodium and potassium, as we saw earlier in the nervous system, they signal the contraction in the cardiac muscle. And we looked at the cardiac muscle, again, in the tissues unit as well as earlier in this unit, and we talked about the tight junctions. The tight junctions, again, are connections between the cells, so plasma membrane of one cell up against the plasma membrane of another cell, but there are actually small holes in the plasma membrane that allow for the depolarization ultimately caused by sodium entering into the cells to then travel between one cell to the next cell over because of these holes within the tight junctions. Because the sodium enters into one cell, causing it to depolarize, as it moves through the holes into the next cell, it causes that cell then to depolarize. And then sodium moves into the next cell and depolarization occurs in it. And what happens, if we go back to that previous slide of the heart beating, is that the heart kind of beats from the top downwards. So the atria squeezes from the top down, squeezing all the blood down into the ventricles. And then as the signal runs along the conduction system here, the ventricles squeeze from the bottom up, so that they can eject all the blood up into the arteries. If we were to actually measure the conduction system and all the depolarization and repolarization that is going on, we would end up with something that looks like this. If you've ever seen an ECG or an EKG, it is ultimately representing the beating of the heart. This is just one beat shown here. But if a patient was actually connected to an ECG or EKG, then we would see this repeating as their heart continued to beat. Each beat is broken down into different regions. We have the P wave, the QRS complex or QRS wave, and then the T wave in each individual beat of the heart. What these regions are showing are the P wave, as indicated here, showing the depolarization of the atrium, which represents the atria contracting. The QRS complex is ventricular depolarization, representing the ventricles depolarizing. Why is the QRS complex so much bigger than the P wave? It's because there's a lot more muscle to the ventricles, as you can see in the image here, than the atria. And so there's a lot more depolarization going on as the ventricles contract. A second reason is because the QRS also has a little bit of increase in size because the atria are actually repolarizing, and it's happening at the exact same time, and therefore the QRS is incorporating the ventricular depolarization and a little bit of added peak because of the atrial repolarization. Finally, we get to the T wave. The atria are already repolarized and relaxed, and now the ventricles are going to undergo ventricular repolarization and ventricular relaxation. Before we move on here, we should note that there's various terminology being used here. The depolarization is ultimately representing contraction, and the repolarization representing relaxation. Earlier we talked about atrial systole, and systole meant contraction. And we talked about atrial diastole, which meant relaxation. Again, we can use that terminology interchangeably and say atrial depolarization is occurring in the P wave, and therefore atrial systole is occurring, or atrial contraction. It's a challenge, but you should get used to these interchangeable words so that you can effectively communicate with people using the various terminology. As we were mentioning, the SA node, or the pacemaker, is responsible for the pace, or the speed, of the conduction of the heart. But what tells the pacemaker to speed up or slow down based on our body needs? Ultimately, the autonomic nervous system has effects on the heart like it does the other tissues in our body. How it does that is, we can see here that the sympathetic system will have an effect on the SA node, the AV node, as well as the force of contraction of the myocardium. The sympathetic nervous system, as discussed in the nervous system unit, is the fight or flight response. And so when we're in a situation that's fearful, our sympathetic nervous system will trigger the SA node to actually beat faster. It will trigger the AV node to not wait as long before sending the signal down through the bundle of His and the Purkinje fibers. It will also signal the myocardium to contract with greater force to squeeze as much blood out of the heart as possible. The parasympathetic system only triggers the SA node and the AV node, and it does the opposite of the sympathetic fight or flight response. It is the rest and repair or rest and digest system, and ultimately it will tell the SA node and the AV node to slow down, decreasing the heart rate. How does the heart ultimately know what to do? The sympathetic nervous system is releasing the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. The parasympathetic system is releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So based on the receptors on the SA node, AV node, and the myocardium, depending on what neurotransmitter is being released, they will bind with different receptors, and therefore the heart will get the appropriate signal and be able to interpret that signal properly.